A listener production.
Hi, Natarsha Belling with you and welcome to the afternoon edition of The Briefing. Coming up in our deep dive, it's being labelled as a major diplomatic blunder by the Albanese government. At the last minute, Papua New Guinea pulling out of an historic treaty that now puts serious pressure on Australia's security and diplomatic standing in the Pacific. We'll unpack exactly what this means for our relationship with our nearest neighbour and why it's a major win for China. But first, let's check the afternoon headlines this Wednesday, the 17th of September. A number of protesters have been arrested in England after projected images of Donald Trump and sex offender Jeffrey Epstein were displayed on a castle ahead of the US president's state visit. 4 adults were arrested on suspicion of malicious communications, which police described as a public stunt. The demonstrators broadcast a video montage of President Trump and Jeffrey Epstein for several minutes onto one of the towers of Windsor Castle west of London. The images were shown shortly after the US president landed in the UK. It comes as the Australian journalist who was attacked by President Trump during a press conference before he left the US breaks his silence. John Lyons from Four Corners asking President Trump about his family's business dealings when the US president lashed out at him saying he was setting a bad tone and his questions were hurting Australia. Here is John Lyons speaking on the ABC.
If our job as journalists is to hold truth to power, then surely asking legitimate questions politely to the President of the United States should be acceptable. But in this day and age in America now, it's not.
Hundreds of jobs are set to go in one of Queensland's biggest coal mines. BHP has announced around 750 jobs will go across its operations at Mitsubishi Alliance in central Queensland, saying the impact of high royalties imposed by the state government is to blame. The New South Wales Government has announced the biggest overhaul of the state's planning laws in half a century. The Minns government will introduce so-called targeted assessment pathways to fast-track development approvals and bypass local councils. And Virgin Australia has launched its pet-in-cabin flights. From today, customers will be able to book tickets for small cats and dogs to fly alongside their owners on select routes between Melbourne, the Gold Coast and the Sunshine Coast. Fares for the furry passengers will be $149 per flight. Only pets under 8 kilos, including their carrier, will be permitted, and a maximum of 4 animals can be booked per service. Now it's time to get into our deep dive on the fallout from the failed defence treaty between Australia and Papua New Guinea. In a major embarrassment for Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, the deal fell over at the last minute, raising serious questions about our role and security in the critical Pacific region. We speak with Pacific Islands diplomatic expert Mihai Sora on why this is a concerning setback for Australia, but a key win for China. Mihai, thank you so much for joining us. My first analogy of what's unfolded today is wow. Did anyone see this coming?
Well, certainly Prime Ministers Albanese and James Marape did not see this coming. I think they both fully expected to sign a defence treaty, a historic defence treaty between Australia and Papua New Guinea today.
It's being described by the opposition at the time of this recording. They've said it's actually a foreign policy embarrassment. Do you agree with that analogy?
I think what it shows is just how difficult Pacific diplomacy has become for Australia. I mean, we have to remember over the last few years, the Australian government has been lifting its game in the Pacific in a lot of ways, increasing defence spend, increasing sports diplomacy, increasing community ties, labour mobility, all these sorts of low-hanging fruit, but we're really at the sticky point of geopolitical competition in the Pacific now. Australia is starting to lay down some pretty big asks from Pacific countries, things that do affect sovereignty and strategic alignment. These are going to be tough for any government. They're hard conditions for Pacific countries to fulfill. It's easy to imagine how the Australian Prime Minister went on this trip fully expecting to be able to sign this defense treaty. He would have had assurances and reassurances time and again from James Marape and from his team, particularly after what happened in Vanuatu only a couple of weeks before. But ultimately, there are domestic political forces at play within Pacific countries, and these are really sensitive issues. So a large part of this is to do with things that Australia is not fully in control of. Could the PM have been more prepared going into this? Perhaps, but I think it's a vulnerability for any Australian leader, and a lesson. I think it's a very hard-learned lesson for any Australian leader as they're aiming for these really top-shelf diplomatic agreements with Pacific countries.
So let's unpack, if we possibly can, about what has happened here, because we know the Prime Minister was pretty confident. He made a pretty clear declaration he was going there to sign the treaty between Papua New Guinea and Australia, and then it seems like the deal has fallen through at the last minute. Why?
I think people will be poring over the entrails of exactly what happened in weeks to come. My initial read is that, one, that Prime Minister James Marape, Prime Minister of Papua New Guinea, fully expected the deal to be signed today. Obviously, the Australian Prime Minister did as well. It's highly likely that Marape went into these discussions thinking that he had the full confidence of the cabinet. It's inconceivable that this issue wouldn't have been discussed over and again within the PNG cabinet. But perhaps at the last minute, some members of his government chose to not endorse the agreement. They voted with their feet. I mean, on the face of it, they weren't present. They couldn't achieve a quorum. But obviously, this would be the most significant international agreement that PNG would have ever signed. So you'd want to be there on the day if you were in support of this agreement. But perhaps Prime Minister Marape didn't have the full support of his cabinet. It shows that there may be issues that still need to be discussed and negotiated within PNG on its own side before they can fully come back to the table to progress this with Australia.
So in regards to breaking this treaty down, you mentioned before there may have been very, very key concerns locally from within the PNG Parliament about signing this deal with Australia. What do you mean by that? What were some of the conditions that clearly made some key players within the PNG Parliament very nervous?
So in the communique that the two prime ministers issued today, in place of signing the agreement, we see the full substantive provisions laid out for us. So mutual defence obligations between Australia and Papua New Guinea, the integration of our defence forces, recruitment pathway for Papua New Guinean nationals to serve in the Australian Defence Force, and then also critically issues around exclusivity with respect to third parties. So, for example, the agreement would block China out of signing similar security agreements, potentially block China out of critical infrastructure agreements. This is the sort of language that we see in agreements that Australia's signing up around the Pacific where it can. Now, these are issues that directly touch on Papua New Guinea's sovereignty and critically would change its non-aligned status. They limit the ability of Papua New Guinea to be friends to all in the same way that they have been up to now. And these are issues that are fiercely contested within PNG politics, within PNG communities, within PNG civil society. These are issues that still need to be resolved by Papua New Guinea as a country. But these are the sticking points, and these are also the provisions that would make the agreement significant for Australia. I mean, we've already got a bilateral security agreement with Papua New Guinea. We have about 50 years of defence cooperation and other kinds of security cooperation. So basically ever since Papua New Guinea became independent, and of course for many decades beforehand. So there's already a lot happening, and these are the key provisions that would make the treaty worth the squeeze.
So do you think, considering these latest developments, that we will actually see China then re-emerge as a main player in this area? This, to me, really highlights how critical Papua New Guinea is and any type of alliance in the changing geopolitical landscape right now.
Look, China already had a stab at these sorts of agreements. It managed to sign a security pact with Solomon Islands in 2022, but it failed to get a region-wide security agreement over the line shortly after that, when the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi toured a number of countries in the Pacific. We know for a fact that China's strategic interest in the Pacific is still there. But in some ways, this is also a red flag for the limitations on China in terms of how far it can progress its own security interests. So what it really shows is Pacific countries, or at least elements within Pacific governments, are still holding fast to this principle of non-alignment. Now, that doesn't mean non-alignment with Australia. It means non-alignment with anybody. So for Papua New Guinea, for example, it does keep China in the game. They do have some security interest in that country already. They provide uniforms, relatively uncontroversial types of security support. And with PNG not yet signing exclusivity clauses with Australia with respect to China, it also keeps China in the critical infrastructure discussion with Papua New Guinea if they choose to maintain that interest. So it shows that Pacific countries still prefer to balance between Australia and China. But it doesn't necessarily leave an open door for China to come in and replace Australia with its own version of the same kind of treaty.
So what do you think the fallout with this will be? Because clearly one may argue that the Prime Minister was completely, and the Australian government was completely blindsided by this. They thought the treaty was done and dusted. Do you think it will be signed over the next couple of months, or do you think negotiations will continue and we won't see a locked treaty with Papua New Guinea in the near future?
We won't see very much on the face of it, because particularly for these really sensitive diplomatic issues, these sensitive provisions to do with sovereignty, with alignment, the most effective way that Australia can engage with a country like Papua New Guinea is quietly. So it won't be megaphone diplomacy. It would be counterproductive for Australia to put pressure on Papua New Guinea in a public way. You'll see the Australian Prime Minister has been downplaying how significant this failure is, because if he kicks up a stink, for example, that puts further pressure on Prime Minister Marape. It may actually make it more difficult for him to progress the agreement. So you'll see, well, you won't see, but there will be some really intensive, quiet diplomacy. The strategic stakes for Australia are still very, very high in the Pacific. The security needs for Papua New Guinea are still very, very high. So both countries have strong incentives to continue to try to find ways to elevate the security partnership. But putting a deadline on some of these really sensitive issues would make things more difficult than they need to be. And in fact, there may have been one of the fundamental weaknesses of this process. For example, we saw at the start of this year that both governments announced the negotiations of the treaty. We know that both governments informally were aiming for Papua New Guinea's independence celebrations as that moment to mark the signing of the treaty. Now, that's a very short space of time, from the beginning of this year up to what we are now in September. 9 months to sign a bilateral security treaty that would fundamentally change Papua New Guinea's foreign policy outlook. This would be the first such agreement that country would have signed with any country ever. It was a huge high watermark, and having a deadline only put additional pressure on the negotiations.
So should this be seen as a major setback for Australian foreign policy, or do you think we will still be, without this treaty, a major player in the Pacific?
Well, if you think of what's lost, Australia and PNG, they have a bilateral security agreement. Papua New Guinea is still Australia's closest security partner in the Pacific without the signing today. So it's a missed opportunity. It's an opportunity cost. It's a setback because, of course, there's been intensive negotiations and a huge amount of investment in the relationship over the last few years, and especially over this past year. But I think the governments of both countries will be very careful not to allow oxygen that would suggest that it's somehow derailing the political relationship. I mean, the key point to understand is this is a really intimate partnership that was on the table. As members of the Australian government have said, it's the kind of relationship that Australia really only has with countries like the United States or New Zealand. So it's a really big deal, and it's one that both countries will want to continue to try to pursue. But, if you're keeping a scorecard, for example, anyone watching this from Beijing would be celebrating over the apparent failure of the Australian government to sign the security treaty.
Very interesting indeed. We appreciate your analysis. Thanks so much for joining us.
It's been a real pleasure. Thanks for having me.
That was Mihai Sora, the Director of the Pacific Islands Program at the Lowy Institute. And that's it for this episode of the afternoon edition of The Briefing. We'd love you to subscribe or follow us on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast. And we'll be back in your feed tomorrow morning. I'm Natarsha Belling. Thanks for your company.